needs to duck out quickly, you will be able to view these sessions later on. We do strongly encourage that you attend it as it's happening live, just so you can pass on any questions as it's happening to make it a little bit easier. But just in case, there will be a recorded webinar version of this that will be provided to you. Our program moderator, Ken, would you like to give us a brief bio?
Yeah, so Ken Beard, Principal Engineer at Safe System Solutions, and before doing that was with Victorian Government for a long time, do lots of road safety auditing, safe system assessing, and lots of bike pedestrian facility stuff, and always enjoying it and love getting out there on the bike and riding around and doing bike audits and the things, and love getting out there with Max. As Max mentioned, this is the webinar version of Zoom. So what I'm going to do is be behind the scenes monitoring the chat, and I'll be feeding questions to Max at different points. I'll be maybe answering questions or getting involved in the chat going on. But that chat function is the way we like you to communicate with us. If for some reason the chat has been disabled due to firewall things or the like, use the Q&A. I can also see that. But let's try and get into the chat. And if you notice things in, or you want to make comment on stuff, please do it straight away. Don't wait for us to pause and say, does anybody have any questions, or does anybody want to make comment on that? Because inevitably after the time to type, we'll have moved on and, we'll be jumping back and forth. So just as you see it, or you've got questions, pop it in there. I'll be behind the scenes. If your technology fails, get out of Zoom, start it up again. It'll probably fix it. If not, there is a dial-in number, but it might be best to just watch the pre-recorded session. My contact details are there. Get in contact with me, anything around the logistics management of the sessions. Max will cover off the bulk of the technical info in the sessions. I'll jump in with bits and pieces and comments. But it is good to see we've got some very passionate cycling infrastructure people from around Australia in the session. So I'm expecting a lot of good chat in this session, Max. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Ken. For those that haven't met me, my name is Max McArdle. I'm the Project Development Lead here at Safe System Solutions, and we'll be running through these modules for the Cycling Infrastructure Training course. There are lots of familiar names out there today, so good to see you coming on board. And for those that I haven't met, hello. My background, similar to Ken, started with Department of Transport or Vic Roads, and I've been involved in the design and construction of multiple shared path bicycle paths, and now I'm regularly involved in auditing and providing best practice cycling advice for different designs across the jurisdiction. So what we will cover throughout these sessions is not specific to one part of Australia or New Zealand. We'll have a look at what different jurisdictions are doing and taking kind of the best components out of every little every state practice, and also looking at international examples, just so we can showcase some of the best practice that's occurring around the world. Hopefully everyone has already received a link to join our learning management system. If you haven't, please do get in touch as soon as possible, because that is where we host all of our content for the training course. The quizzes are kept on there. That's how we issue certificates to confirm completion of this course and assignments. So it's very imperative that you're joined up. So if you haven't got any emails regarding that, please get in touch. We'll get you signed up. But Ken will run through exactly how that looks and all the information you need there later on in this session. To keep everyone engaged and make sure that we have maximum participation and not just putting this in the background and moving on to emails or anything, we have this little sign here, our friend Wally the Wombat. And Wally will appear periodically throughout today's session. And what we'll get you to do is just take a tally of how many times you see Wally the Wombat. So how many times you see that sign. And just to confirm, this one is not included in the count. So you're currently sitting at 0, but just a bit of pen and paper and just take a little note of how many you see through today's session, because there will be a quiz question, which is just how many wallies were spotted in module 1. Just a way to make sure that we're keeping you on this screen here and not trying to tackle any other problems that are going on. We do have course competency requirements as part of this training course. So we like to make sure that participants demonstrate that they have acquired specific knowledge relating to cycling infrastructure. So one of the competencies is attending all of the webinars. So we can see you've attended these things, you've watched these videos, you've been present. Satisfactory completion of all set tasks, and achieve a minimum of 80% pass mark on all quizzes and assignments. So there is 2 quizzes and 2 assignments as part of this training course. It's not going to be, you know, days long work that's going to be particularly rigorous or anything. We understand that this is like you've got other tasks and other work to complete. So we're not trying to get you to write thesis or anything like that, but we do need to see that you've gathered some new knowledge within the cycling infrastructure space, and you can demonstrate that in order to meet that or to get that certificate at the end of this session. So we do allow up to 3 attempts, but we do recommend, if you are struggling with any of the content or any of the questions, just get in touch with Ken or myself. We can organize, you know, a Teams meeting or just a quick catch up on the phone. We'll go through that. Perhaps we haven't communicated something clearly, and hopefully that will get you over the line there. But first point of call, if it's not clear or you're continuing to see the crosses instead of the ticks, just get in touch, because we certainly want to see everyone pass this course. We don't want to have to fail anyone, and we haven't failed anyone. So yeah, it's important that we just, I suppose, be transparent and open in those conversations. Ken, I might get started into the session agenda. Is there anything that I might have missed so far?
No, I think you've done a good job there, Max. Just remind people to get onto that chat, and let's get into some of the content. Oh, sorry, it's a 1.5 hour session, and we're going to go straight through.
That's it. And actually, one final point I will mention is we love giving out prizes here at Safe System Solutions. So if you ask a good question, or you're the first to respond to a question that I pose, you're a chance to win a prize. And what that means is we will keep a tally of, or just a track of, any of those participants that are showing that extra enthusiasm. And once the course is complete and we send off your certificate, we'll also send any prizes that you may have won. So it's good incentive to tap on the keyboard at any time, ask questions, get involved, and yes, so we love giving out prizes.
All right, let's get into it.
Today's focus is all on off-road bicycle facilities, so things like shared paths or bicycle-only paths. The things that we'll be looking at in particular regarding the design are things like the path width, the gradients, hazards, sight lines and fencing, and how all of those components of the shared path can actually impact the level of safety as well as the level of comfort for path users. We'll also look into the environment of, well, what happens when we have a shared path that crosses over a carriageway, a road, and how do we manage those conflict points? So we'll look at cycling priority treatments. We'll look at things like bollards, which are incredibly well used and present across the network. And we'll also have a brief discussion about DDA requirements. Finally, we'll touch on shared paths crossing other shared paths, and we'll mention things like wayfinding signage and how best to manage that interaction, as well as managing cyclist speeds where there's lots and lots of other path users. So there could be lots of pedestrians, for instance, and making sure that cyclists slow down to give way. The content for today, as mentioned, is sourced from a variety of jurisdictions, and it's largely focused on what would be considered best practice. So there's lots of examples here which illustrate exactly how infrastructure is best designed and implemented to create a safe and comfortable outcome for cyclists within that environment. Ken?
We're covering e-scooters today, Max.
It won't be explicitly about e-scooters. They're kind of a realm of their own, and they are different jurisdictions also have different policies, how they're managed. So not going to be exclusively covered today. Apologies for that. But yes, so that's the agenda for today. I'll get stuck straight into it. And we actually have this off-road facility here that runs along an esplanade, and it's a little bit difficult to see, but this is exclusively for cyclists. So pedestrians, they walk closer to the esplanade here, and they're shifted away, and bikes are given the sole priority within this space. This is a really good example when you have lots and lots of high volumes of either pedestrians or cyclists, because if you're trying to just bring both of those users within the same space, when there are those high volumes, you run the risk of cyclists having to weave in and out and, you know, creating that little bit of uncomfortable tension between the path users. And also increasing the risk of cyclists colliding with other cyclists heading in the other direction or with other path users. So really good example of where you've got significant volumes of both peds and cyclists, separating those two path users and building separate facilities. Now, I will say that in a perfect world, that's exactly how this environment would work, but I acknowledge that generally pedestrians will, you know, pause and wait on the on the bicycle path there, and similarly cyclists might want to ride along the esplanade. So it's not perfectly, it's not constraining, you know, those two users to use those facilities, but the intention is, well, let's get our higher moving cyclists using this part of the network and pedestrians who like to meander over there. This kind of works into this graph here. For those who may have seen this, this is from the Austroads Guide to Road Design, Part 6A, Paths for Walking and Cycling. You may notice that source comes up frequently throughout the slides. Just in case you want to reference that yourself, you can have it's just a quick link to find exactly where this graph has come from. But what this is saying, if we have a look along the x-axis, it's saying the number of cyclists two-way per peak period. It's a very long way of saying just how many cyclists do you have within this area. Similarly, the y-axis is how many pedestrians do you have within the area. Now, the main takeaway I'd like you to grasp from this particular slide or this figure is, as we're increasing both in the X and the Y, so we're into this category right in the top right corner, you'll see what it's actually recommending is a 4-meter bike path and a 4-meter footpath. So it's suggesting if we've got really, really high volumes of both users, let's put a 4-meter wide bike path and a 4-meter wide footpath. So it's not saying let's share this and create a shared path, because the numbers are just too high. Regularly, however, we are working within this 3-meter shared path cross section. So a 3-meter shared path is incredibly common and typically what's designed for. But if you are working within, you know, CBD environments or just high cycling corridor use environments, strategic cycling corridors, then you may benefit from thinking about, okay, well, maybe instead of providing a shared path where cyclists and peds just use, let's try and separate those two. Another means which helps to define the cross-sectional width of our paths has been provided also within the Austroads Guide to Road Design Part 6A. And it gives you these very, very brief descriptions of different types of paths. So a local access path, a regional path, a recreational path. There are brief descriptions like in the glossary of the Austroads, but it's fairly open to interpretation. It's not incredibly, there's not metrics which would say this is what constitutes a local access or regional or recreational. So there's a little bit of cloudiness exactly how you would apply this. All I would say within this environment is if we have a look at the local access path on the left here, this kind of 2 meter wide, it's basically a footpath. It's not really wide enough to cater for cyclists in either direction. As you can see, 2 people there walking side by side. There's really nowhere for a cyclist to safely pass them, or you know, they'd best have to wait until eventually it goes to single file. So generally, we don't like to head towards the lowest of those minimum widths. We like to start at the upper boundary there and work towards providing a project that can fit that. Ken.
Some good chat coming in already, just around clarifying what will be covered. The question, though, related to this one you're just talking about, does a less than 3 meter wide shared path increase the risk of a head-on collision?
Yes, I would suggest it would. As soon as you start narrowing things, and particularly if there's sightline issues or anything like that, you're increasing the risk of a path user straying into the other lane, as it were, and potentially colliding with others. So, yep.
Yeah, and also associated with that is the runoff path crash risk, because avoiding that and leaving, so that shouldn't be forgotten either. Another one around, there's a bit of discussion about, are we going to be covering sort of safe system fundamentals and the philosophy of the safe system? And I've written a note back saying, well, we're not going to go into depth on that. That's a sort of 3-module exercise in its own right. We were more into the specifics of design and consideration for bikes, although it's fairly well underpinned by the safe system philosophy and thinking about trying to minimize the likelihood of crash and the severity of crash and sort of biomechanics. But if you can sort of integrate any of that in there.
Yeah.
And then a related one to that was, have you had a look at the Healthy Streets Assessment Tool and to see how their metrics compare to Safe System?
Yeah, the Healthy Streets Assessment is a fantastic tool for anyone out there measuring these types of things and trying to prioritize projects, but it's not explicitly detailed within this this webinar, because there's actually quite a range of different tools out there that we could use to evaluate these types of treatments. So we don't try to suggest that one of them would suit a project more than others. For instance, a safe system assessment or a road safety audit could be conducted to identify risks and opportunities to mitigate risks as well. So there's lots of things out there, but yeah, generally I would say the Healthy Streets assessments do certainly help to improve safe system alignment with these projects. Good question.
Yeah, keep them coming.
I reckon we give out a prize for the Healthy Street assessments there.
Okay. I'm onto the
Keeping me on my toes. I appreciate that.
Good. Keep the questions and comments coming in. Thank you.
All right. So the next category that we have here is this regional path, which broadly is characterized by medium to higher speeds. So it will have some degree of commuter cyclists, but it's not necessarily only going to be used for that purpose. Whereas recreational paths is basically, it's expected to have a land use adjacent that would be parkland or playgrounds or areas for recreation, as the name suggests, indicating that there would be high levels of extreme or very vulnerable road users, which is the very young and the very old, and people accessing that. So people with prams and all those kind of situations. But as I said, these categories are quite broadly defined, so that it's not definitive exactly, or there's not a classification network that shows exactly this is what each of these types of systems look like. We'll move into the gradient now. So the gradient is all to do with our vertical kind of geometry. And we've got this graph here, which is talking about uphill gradients. And for me in particular, this is relevant because I am not a strong uphill cyclist. I know Ken with the steel calves is no problem at all, but I actively avoid routes that are too hilly because just doesn't do it for me. And this is where this graph would come in quite handy. For those that are not into the technical design space, appreciate this is perhaps above and beyond what you're expecting for this course, but I'm not going to, grill into all the details. Just want to have a quick look at exactly what this figure is saying and the importance of it. So along the x-axis here, we have our gradient. The higher the gradient, the steeper the hill or the incline. And along the y-axis is our length of gradient. So just looking at a 10% gradient, which is very steep, you would notice a 10% gradient, even as a pedestrian walking. It's suggesting for a desirable outcome for cyclists or for ease of cycling, you should only be keeping that to a minimum of 10 meters. So in other words, if it's going to be really, really steep, it should be for a really, really short amount of time or space. But they've also got this little caveat as well to say, well, there's also like an acceptable range as well, which would be kind of like your extended design domain for those within the technical realm. I've heard those terms, but as I said, don't want you to worry too much if you're not in the design space and don't understand this. It's just about making it easy for cyclists to feel like they're in an environment that suits their abilities. Ken?
A couple of quick ones. One was on the line marking. When do you apply line marking for different path widths? Is it a bit like a road where there's sort of minimum widths and you hit certain line marking? Do you know that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you, Sam. It's done differently every jurisdiction. There's no statewide or national guidance which would suggest at this width it should look like this or like this. Even riding along, the same shared path, you may have discrepancies in the way the line marking is applied. So, unfortunately, at this point in time, there's not a one consistent treatment. And just for those that are curious what this is talking about, but the shared path, sometimes it's just the edge line that's been applied, and that's about it. Other times you actually get the dividing strip to separate the two traffic streams, similar to a carriageway. But there's no, metrics or anything out there that would suggest this is exactly when you should be applying one or the other. Other times it's just the bicycle symbol and the pedestrian symbol, and that's it.
But I would be interested if anybody in the group does have a preferred way of doing that or their preferred guidance. Share that in with everybody. And Michael's asking for a photo of a 10% gradient path, which I don't think you've got one.
Let's have a look at the next slide.
Oh, yeah.
This one is quite steep. I couldn't quite confirm, but this is for a pedestrian overpass that crosses over a highway here. And I should say pedestrian and cyclist overpass because it's a shared path connection. And before I spoke about the gradient uphill, I'd like to just throw out a question to the group. Are there any issues with gradients downhill for cyclists? So imagine you're the cyclist, you've got your bike here and you're heading down in this direction here. Can anyone think of anything within this particular scenario that could be of a concern or perhaps a risk that you might note if you were auditing this design?
Okay, good. Let's see if people want to type a few concerns that they might have of this. And while people pop those in, Michael's asked why the two parallel running handrails, which is that an attempt at a bicycle friendly sort of system there?
I would suggest, yeah. So it looks like one of these rails would be, just typical for pedestrians. It's at a little bit of a lower height. So something for them to grab onto. and the higher rail is something that we refer to as cycle-friendly fencing, which we have a slide later on in this presentation to cover that. But I would suggest that's the reason that they've got these two different rails. Not a common feature though. I can't say I see that regularly.
Okay, well, we've got some good stuff coming in. Thanks to everybody here. What are we seeing? Slip hazard, sight lines at the bottom of the merge, hazards at the bottom. Does the fence obscure visibility? Short landing, trees, vegetation, curve radius at the bottom, lack of visibility due to the trees and fence. The vertical elements of the fencing are a risk of handlebar and wheel catching. Wow, this is good, Max. We've got a highly tuned in, educated, excited group. So any of those you want to give prizes to straight away?
Wow, they were some fantastic responses. Clearly, we've got some people that have worked within this space, but the one that grabbed my attention there, Ken, is the visibility or line of sight issues with the fencing here and also the tree as well. That's a good pickup.
Well, there's quite a few people that put that in. So I'm going to have to give it to the first person. I think it was Toby first in there. So, but the other stuff, excellent. You've got to be quick though.
Yes, excellent work. So the reason that I would note that as well is, as I mentioned, if you're a cyclist traveling downhill, even without pedaling, with this kind of gradient and this environment, smooth concrete, you'd be very comfortably sitting at 30 kilometers per hour by the time you're at the toe of that ramp, just because of the length of it. So relatively high speeds. And right at the toe of the ramp, you can't even really see it, but at the bottom of this ramp, it's easier to see here. There's another shared path that connects there, right at the toe. And so if you happen to notice another path user coming in from this direction, basically they could be walking in front of you, they could be cycling in front of you. It's difficult for you on an incline in that downhill environment to be able to press the brakes and avoid that collision, or perhaps, you know, try and move around them or things like that. But the way that this has been set up with the shared path connection at that toe of the ramp is conducive to a high-speed collision, a high speed for shared paths. So instead, another way that this could have been perhaps rectified during the design of this particular project, but just bringing the shared path connection a little bit further along, where the line of sight issue is not as great. It's much easier to see where that intersection between the shared paths is. And also, which we'll discuss later on, but assigning a priority to either of those shared paths, because at the moment it's just whoever gets to this point here, good luck. And if you're in there first, you'll probably get right of way, you'll be the thoroughfare, but it's really important to assign, well, who is actually the main shared path there and who needs to give way to who.
Max, it's all coming in thick and fast. So Maverick's asking about that little landing lip jump thing on the left photo there. What is that, drainage or what's going on there?
So my understanding, and happy to be corrected by anyone, but the kind of way this would look in plan view, it's not a very good drawing. I'll try that one again. Sorry about that. You'd have a section that goes downhill and then a flat section, and then a section that goes downhill, flat section that goes downhill. And it continues in this type of fashion all the way along. My understanding, that's for people in wheelchairs, to give them spaces within those landing sections to pause. And also that's going uphill, but also downhill as well. So don't collect too much speed going downhill and potentially lose control. So as far as I'm aware, this is actually a common design feature in these pedestrian overpasses. And
Toby has a copy of AS 1428 next to his bed and reads it every night, and is in putting in some wonderful information in there that the ramp landings are required at certain intervals, and also that the double handrails can be a requirement for access for people with disabilities. Question around sort of this site and why we're looking at it. Is it a particular crash side or a particular side of risk, or is it just an example of where we like the thinking of potential risks and not waiting for crashes to happen before reacting?
Yes, most likely the latter is the reason for this inclusion. Also, the Austroads guide focus on the uphill gradient. That's kind of what's taken as that's where you get your figure from. That's generally what the designs are catered for. They're worried about cyclists going uphill. Purpose of this slide is to, well, cyclists also likely traveling in the opposite direction. What's at the bottom of that downhill? Are there hazards there? Are there path interactions? Thinking about those things as well. So it's trying to just expand on what's written in the Austroads guide.
Fantastic. And there's a bit of discussion around whether those ramp landing points could be a hazard for a rider as they come down.
So you can feel it as a cyclist, but I wouldn't suggest it's as big of a risk as a hazard. They're generally designed in a manner that reduces any instability issues. So yeah, it's a good question though.
Yeah, let's keep ticking along.
So let's have a look at what our operating width or cyclist envelope is. So similar for, general traffic and heavy vehicles who have an envelope, cyclists also have an envelope. So the operating width of a bicycle and rider is generally taken as 1 meter. There's a little caveat in that if cyclists are going uphill, you may know that they kind of go left and right to gain a little bit of momentum, which would bring that operating width a little bit wider. So Austroads is actually talking about increasing that to 1.5 meters, which would then, that could have a follow-on effect to other things within the design world. But at the moment, it's taken as 1 meter. So we'll just have to watch this space to see things change. But what that's actually saying is the actual width of the handlebars of a typical bicycle is 750 mil, 0.75 meters, which means there's only 125 mil clearance from the bicycle to the end of that operating width. So there's not a lot of clearance there. The most important aspect here, or one of the most important aspects here, is what we consider an appropriate offset from hazards from that operating width. 0.5 meter is the desirable, and that's generally taken as the constant. So we're trying to apply a 0.5 meter offset from where the shared path would end is generally taken as the operating width. There's a 0.2 minimum there, but that would really only apply if it is a smooth feature. So that's where cycle-friendly fencing, where that kind of feature is okay to be within such a tight space of a cyclist, because it's less of a hazard compared to snagging risks or a utility pole, for instance, or things like that. The final point on this slide here is just the height of the bicycle and rider is about 2.2 meters and require a head clearance of 0.2 meters for it. So anyone doing any work within underpasses or cyclists using culverts as a means to connect shared paths, that head clearance will certainly become very relevant to you. So, Ken.
Sorry, Max, just another quick one around passing and overtaking clearances needed for other path users on a shared path. So thinking about, what sort of spaces we might need for that.
So I haven't seen any guidance that would particularly stipulate when to provide overtaking opportunities or things like that. To me, where it's useful to widen paths to allow for that opportunity is where you've got shared path connections. In other words, similar to what you would do at a rural intersection, say it's a T intersection, you might provide just that little bit of extra width or, build out the shoulder. So if a right turning vehicle into the minor leg, someone else can overpass them to the left and can carry on. Similar kind of design philosophy within the shared path space, but that's not really, I've never seen that written in guidance. It's more just a a philosophy that's kind of evolved over the years. Yeah.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of, I suppose, road design guidance that
Yeah.
those theories haven't yet translated to people making firm decisions around, shared path design guidance and things like overtaking opportunities and overtaking lanes and clearances required for that and the like. Another question that's come in is around now. There are many types of bicycles out there, Max, aren't there? So,
That's
how we get into this particular one as the design guide bike?
It's a very valid question. I mean, we are moving in a space where e-bikes are becoming more and more prominent. Recumbent bicycles, tricycles, unicycles, there's lots of different ways to get around. I suppose this is just a means of identifying what a typical cyclist would look like in terms of their geometries. Similar how we have a standardized car, similarly how we have a standardized heavy vehicle. So it's not a perfect illustration of this is exactly going to cater for all different types of cyclists, but it's just trying to take a snapshot of what the average would look like.
Yeah. So I just to build on that. I mean, really for me, these is your design vehicle. And it's not to stop you having a checking vehicle within your design thinking. So for example, when designing specific shared path facilities or the like, you want to also think about your cargo bike and your larger types of bikes to ensure that we're not going to build something that is does not let that larger occasional bike be able to fit through that from a square path perspective or a width perspective. So yeah, it goes a little bit back to the just general design philosophy again.
All right, I might carry on there, Ken, because there's still a few slides to get through. We've got some hazards here, very common hazards that are seen adjacent shared paths, or in this case, within a shared path. These kind of design features that perhaps look trivial, or they may not seem a big issue within when you're looking at a design or anything, but just having that sense check or that audit completed by someone that is a cyclist or uses cycling facilities or is experienced within this space can help to rectify these issues before they get built. But just having a little bin shelter that's actually off the shared path as opposed to being constructed on it. This is an example of a concrete path that hasn't been backfilled and battered. The slope hasn't been battered. So likely this has got to do with just the construction of this particular path. The solution here is just building up all of this rock backfill material and creating a nice smooth transition there. If you were to come off on your bike, at this location, unless you had a mountain bike, you'd be very unlikely to be able to get back onto the shared path. Final little hazard here, it's just a utility pole is very, very well hidden by the vegetation that's overgrown it, and the edge of the shared path is about here. So it hasn't met that 1/2 meter clearance that I was talking about before. Basically, if you were riding along in this direction, it'd be possible for a handlebar to snag on that utility pole. And it becomes more of a risk when you have lots and lots of activity occurring on this side, or maybe there's a person walking a dog and the dog decides to walk along here, so you're forced to swerve and then you're colliding with the utility pole. So considering all these different hazards and what could be done within these situations to improve safety. An example of that final hazard and what's been done in this particular environment is installing these kind of paddles or flexible bollards, as they're called, just showing that the path narrows at this location due to this gantry foundation. For those that haven't heard of gantry, this is just like a base for a large sign that is shooting over the carriageway there. So yeah, what they've done I would suggest this is a post-construction audit is noted that the shared path narrows and providing these, paddles here just to make it more conspicuous that there is a hazard in this area. This is a relatively recent job. It's only, I'd say 3-4 years old, maybe. So it is surprising that, in the design stage that the decision wasn't made just to shift this hazard outside of the shared path. You could build a retaining wall to get rid of all that material as well. Much easier to design out these issues rather than get to construction and making these, slight improvements to the safety, but there still is a risk of colliding with the hazard, colliding with other path users at that location as well, where it narrows. So much easier to try and rectify these things during design. Got a slide here just to show that there are sightline calculations for cyclists. So for those that don't do too much sightline calculations, may not have come across this, that's fine. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just wanted to mention that as there is sightline stopping distances and all that kind of things for general traffic, there's also the same calculations for cyclists. So basically, how far away do their sight lines need to be for a cyclist to be able to spot a hazard and to be able to safely stop, so they're not just forced to ride straight into it? Ken?
Well, that links with another comment that came in around the difference in eye height for different riders and whether we should be designing particularly for kids or that 1.4, which is the typical eye height, and how you might factor that in or the like.
Yeah, so you could certainly run this calculation a couple of times, just spit out some different results depending on the expected users within that environment. So it's certainly a consideration you can do. Generally, it's taken as an average, just like the cyclist envelope is taken as an average as well. But there's nothing against saying that you don't run those design scenarios and consider how different users within that area would experience that that facility.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I mean, like crests, sags, over, underpasses and then bits around, it's all, you're going to get benefit for being taller in some points and benefit being lower in some other points. So yeah. It's all a bit of a, horses for courses. If you can make it good for everybody, that's great. If not, we're looking to provide that reasonable and sort of 1.4 sits in that reasonable. Those bollards at the back, I mean, they're flexible bollards. They're those air-filled plastic flexible bollards. They're not going to be a snag hazard or catch a pedal. And so just some question around, was that the right choice? As you say, if you get it right in design, you don't need all of that because your path maintains that width. Reducing sight lines might be used to encourage slower speeds, particularly at conflict points. So that's been I mean, the UK's done a fair bit of research around reducing sight lines on the approach to roundabouts particular. So, intentionally providing screens or hedges so that people slow down on the approach to the conflict point, because if the theory being that if you've got two good sight lines that you just, that people go through fast. In terms of that around cycle paths, cycle facilities, there's a little bit more of, well, I don't know, your comments on that, Max, but definitely the documentation around at the moment is very much about trying to provide open sight lines as much as possible for both users, even the one without, even the one with priority, to be able to react and stop as needed. So your safe intersection sight distance style thinking. Or any comments to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, anecdotally, where there are restricted sight lines, there's not necessarily changes in cyclist behavior, just thinking of the upfield shared path that we were talking about there before, Ken. But even where you've got really limited view of the carriageway, cyclists may slow down a little bit, but generally want to keep going across those carriageways and kind of understand that they're low volume environments and think that they're pretty good chance of making it across. And yeah, so just because you've got restricted sight lines doesn't necessarily you're going to make cyclists slow down and stop, because it's more difficult to slow down and stop for a cyclist than it is just in a vehicle.
Yeah, well, we can. So yeah, I mean, I can certainly talk to people in depth about this sight lines and the like for cycle path priority. I've been doing a lot of stuff working on that and getting clarification around principles and operational. And it's just like there's a lot we could talk about. The one, I suppose, thing that came in, a couple of things there. In terms of selection of that speed, I mean, you need a selection of speed within that. What are you doing that on approach to the particular point of interest? How do you determine it?
Yeah, so it is going to be an assumption, unless you're able to collect data there and, getting an 85th percentile type of speed there for that particular location, but likely it's going to be an assumption. So you look at things of, well, what's the geometry? Is it uphill? Is it downhill? Is it flat? What's the actual path material? If it's, just loose aggregate, or if it's a nice smooth concrete surface, that will play an impact. Also, what's the actual general makeup? Is it recreational cyclists? Is it commuters getting to work? All these types of things you try and factor in, but generally kind of 20 to 30 kilometer per hour, I would suggest it's a bit of a benchmark within shared path spaces.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the TMR, the shared path crossing guidelines, have some figures in there, as do the Victorian Department of Transport supplements. There's stuff in Austroads, so you can gather a different info. 20 for a shared path, 30 for a dedicated cycleway is your general rule of thumb, and then you're going to adjust that based on uphills, downhills, curves, and different speed management techniques. Toby also makes a wonderful point in there around some differences in, the 2.2 meters, 1.4 eye height, and then we know we've got kids in there, so some sort of range would be is a good approach to go for if you can. Beautiful, Max. Let's keep moving on, and we're halfway through, or past halfway through.
That's the calculation. And for those not interested in mathematics as part of today's course, we'll just apply that straight to a situation and why that's important. So in this diagram here, we've got a cyclist heading around this curve in the shared path, and there's an object, which we're going to call a hazard, that's located just on the edge of this bend. And because of this bushes and vegetation, there's actually an obstruction to those line of sight. So that's where that calculation comes in handy. How far around that bend can cyclists see? Are they able to stop in time, or would they collide with that hazard? And an actual example of this in the real world, this is actually a shared path. It doesn't look like it, but that is an asphalt surfacing. Here's a hedge which does a fantastic job of blocking any hazard that would be around that bend, and that could be, someone might have fallen over and is on the other side of that bend. There could be a snake, which would be terrifying, that could be on the other side of that bend, or there could be the shared path could have collapsed, or a big pothole, or anything like that. But because of that obstruction, it makes it very difficult. So you would already be slowing down as a cyclist, but are you able to safely stop prior to colliding with a hazard that is around that bend? So that's the purpose of that calculation. As I alluded to before, cycling safe fencing and fencing requirements in general. There is a little bit of guidance to when to apply fencing. So we'll have a look first on the left-hand side here. And this is regarding if there's a large drop-off, think of like a cliff face or something like that. So Y is that height of the drop-off, and X being the distance from the edge of the path to that drop-off. And what the table is telling us is if X is less than 2 meters, so the hazard's less than 2 meters away, and Y is less than 250 mil, it's saying a fence isn't required with a little asterisk, because it's saying instead batter off the surface. So it's instead saying instead of putting a fence there, just as I drew previously, just try and grab some loose fill there and batter it instead. So just using natural earth to create a slope rather than have that kind of sheer vertical face. Won't go into all those details when to apply the different types of fencing, but there's two different categories there, which are partial barrier fence and full barrier fence. And I've got a slide that will show you what those two descriptions actually mean. The other criteria that would warrant a fence would be if the adjacent slope is too steep. So think of, just like maybe you're in a cutting or something like that, and you've got something that's incredibly steep adjacent it. Once again, X is being used to show the distance from the edge of the path to that hazard being the slope. And Z is for those that do those rise over run type of calculations. It's just referring to the horizontal distance, with 1 being the vertical. So the lower the number, it's saying that's more of an incline. Basically, it's just all to do with the steepness of it. For those that are interested in this technical advice, just thought we'd provide it here. But in terms of practicality, what we're actually saying is, if we've got a significant drop off, like in this case here, a partial barrier fence has been provided. And what that means is you've got these rails here, which would, stop a cyclist or contain a cyclist, hopefully. There is still the risk of, perhaps smaller children or to tumble through those kind of gaps, those little windows there. That's why it's called a partial fence. And a full containment there is where you've got these vertical members that stretch the whole way along, and that would, there's no way of getting through that. It's just not a wide enough gap to fit any limbs or people. So that's the full barrier. It's just it's kind of a little bit bizarre why you wouldn't just have one type of treatment, but that's what they've stipulated in the Austroads guys, and it's in Australian standards as well. The most critical feature, though, as I've touched on a few times, is the cycle-friendly fencing. And that is a feature which you can see designated by this smooth deflection rail. And basically, what's happening is this rail is situated about 1.2 meters above ground level, which roughly works out to, if you were on your bicycle, it's just slightly above your wrist height. So if you were cycling and you collided with one of these cycle-friendly fences, instead of your handlebar hitting that feature, your arm from your wrist up to your shoulder would instead collide with that. So rather than having a really sharp kind of snagging outcome, if that was a little bit lower or that had vertical members or anything like that, you've got one smooth deflection rail, one smooth member there, which would collect you at your arm level and hopefully guide you along that rail, increasing your chance of staying on your bike. So there's a whole, there's definitely a reason and some good thinking that's been done to create the rail at the particular height and with that one particular smooth feature as well, and that's to keep cyclists on their bike if they do happen to hit these. And you would be blown away the number of times where shared paths, where we have all this cycling infrastructure and cycling volumes, and they don't include this smooth deflection rail. It could just be, chain mesh fence, or it could be the old pool mesh fencing and things like that. But that smooth deflection rail, referred to as cycle-friendly fencing, is really, really important. All right, I'll keep flicking through. Just another graphical illustration of the fencing requirements. So longitudinal fences with rounded posts, smooth rails. We don't want to see any curving towards the user. And we also don't want to consider any low fences as well. So things like planter boxes, they look beautiful, but they can actually be a peddling risk. So your foot there could snag on that and create a hazard as well. Ken.
I was just sharing that Michael's put in a link to the really wonderful TMR guidance document around fencing with some good visual examples of risks and a risk assessment tool. So thanks for sharing that, Michael.
Thanks very much, Michael. Maybe we'll give out a prize there to Michael, Ken.
Sharing the info.
Love sharing is caring.
Yep. Great.
And got another chance here for people to get involved. And Ken, I believe we've got a poll for this one. If I could get you to launch the poll.
Yes.
What I'll do is I'll just move this banner here to give everyone a better look.
And people can move the poll around their screen if it's in the way.
Yeah, but the question is, should fencing be installed along this shared path? So I'll just try and draw what I'm talking about with this question. Should we have a fence with the smooth deflection rail be installed here and also on the other side? That's a pretty good drawing, Ken. That's one of my better ones.
No, it's good. You even curved it around nicely at the end.
So just based on that brief discussion regarding the hazards adjacent.
And now, I should say to everybody, you're not being marked on these polls.
Oh, yeah.
So relax. You only get marked after the session. So, all right. I think I'm going to hit end on that in 3, 2, 1. And Paul got everybody's results. Let's share those. Most people saying no fencing, Matt.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I would suggest that it's not necessarily the greatest safety risk if you're just leaving that as is. So the offset requirement that I spoke about before was that 0.5 meter. And for those that did say yes, well, I didn't actually tell you how far away that hazard there was or how far away these bushes were planted and things like that. So perhaps you were concerned about those as hazards. I would just say, if a cyclist were to kind of run off path at these locations, it's onto vegetation, you know, a nice soft landing, I suppose. So it's not likely to cause too much grievances. If that was a water course there or something, you know, more fixed hazards installed more regularly, that would perhaps be warrant to include the fencing. But generally, I agree. I think this is not necessarily an environment that would warrant the fencing there, Ken.
Yep. Okay, let's get going.
Fabulous. Okay. So we can now move into this topic of shared paths crossing roads. So this is actually a really wonderful example. It's quite unique in the sense that the shared path is running right in the middle of the median. So on the right-hand side, hopefully the drawings are working, you'll see there's traffic stream heading towards the screen. On the left-hand side, it's not really in the photo, but traffic stream heading away from the screen. And cyclists and pedestrians have got this space right in the middle that just runs straight through this section. However, there are periodically these little openings to allow motorists to, you know, do a U-turn or access local side streets or things like that. At every one of these openings, they've assigned priority to shared path users. So rather than forcing cyclists and pedestrians to stop, slow, give way, vehicles have the priority because it's the carriageway, they've flipped that and they've made a decision to give cyclists free run so they can just keep cycling through these sections. And in order to facilitate that, the way that this has been constructed is the carriageway itself is raised up. So it's at the same level as the shared path. And so you've got this kind of speed hump, you would call it, I suppose, vertical deflection for the carriageway, which means you are forcing vehicles to travel slowly as they cross that conflict point, which is a big tick. And the other item to note, which you can't see in this photo, but there are stop signs. And it says, I or is it stop or give way? I can't remember. Give way to pedestrians and cyclists because they have the priority within these zones here. So really awesome example. Got a couple more of these cyclist priority treatments installed here. This one on the left-hand side, as you can see, it's got the give way, and then there's a little panel underneath, which is just to specify it's giving way to vulnerable road users, to pedestrians and cyclists. So it's not just give way at this intersection to vehicles, it's saying give way to path users. So that supplementary sign is very, very important detail. This one on the right-hand side is another example of that raised crossing, which we love to see. But I'm slightly more inclined to say that this left example is best practice, and I'll open that up to the group. Any ideas why I would consider the one on the left-hand side perhaps a little bit more attractive to cyclists and also to vehicles that are passing that crossing point?
Okay, we'll let people pop a few things in there. Michael's asking, is the right one Woolloongabba?
It's on the Brisbane Bicentennial Bike Path, but I am not entirely sure what section of it.
And then should there be painted zebra crossings at these locations? I suppose, just to answer that one quickly, that they're shared path crossings. So the pedestrians have priority within that. It's a specific way of doing it. Usually they're orange, yellow, and the green is more done usually just for cycleways. So that's probably with the right one is just a cycleway, is it? It's not a shared path.
As I understand, yeah, the footpath's over this side.
Yeah. Okay, so we're seeing the 90-degree angle of approach. So sightline would be better for, obviously the cyclist not having to look over their shoulder and the like. Left one highlights vulnerable road users, more difficult to see cyclists turning their head to approaching vehicles, and yes, at the Gabba.
Bang on. So I like the sightlines 90-degree angle. Did I hear that one there, Ken?
Yep. So
I think
Johan was first at that one. So prize there, got to be quick. Ilse was shortly followed behind.
So that's certainly what I had in mind with this one. So if we have a look at the left-hand example, you can see this cyclist, their line of sight there. If they were leading up to this intersection, fairly easy for them to see vehicles as they prop and store and hopefully give way. But if they don't, they've at least made that eye contact and they can, undertake any emergency maneuvers as required. But because of that perpendicular crossing, it's much easier for those two different traffic streams to look at each other. So those sight lines are improved. In this example, as a cyclist, you do want to maintain speed. And if you get to this point and you're trying to turn over your shoulder to look for oncoming vehicles, very, very difficult, just in terms of the mechanics of moving your neck in that direction, and also may make you feel a little bit unstable. In other words, it's unlikely that that would happen to the same extent as in a perpendicular environment. So you've already reduced the effectiveness of that slowing down. And some might argue, well, yeah, but it is a give way. So vehicles, they're going to slow down there and shouldn't be an issue. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way. And vehicles may not see that give way sign, may not understand what's happening at this, may drive straight through it. There's a host of reasons why that single regulatory sign may fail. So instead, if we can kind of design for those failures and perhaps mitigate that as a risk through perpendicular crossing, I think it's a good outcome for cyclists.
So Max, just before that, there's some really good discussion in there around the placement of signage, and is it obvious who's to give way at that location, because it could be thought of the cyclist. And then a really good point in there around the use of raised features here to, does that improve the compliance with the giveaway? And the answer is yes, it does. It certainly does. These raised features are wonderful for increasing compliance with giveaway scenarios.
Yes, raised features would be considered best practice as we're doing these shared paths crossing over carriageways, which is why we're spending so much time on it now. But here's another snapshot of what this actually looks like. And if you have a look at all these kind of brake marks that are occurring just prior to crossing over at this location. So that could be indicative of, just slowing down and getting a good glimpse, or it could be indicative of, having to be forced into undertaking that emergency braking. So, yeah, it's not to say that this Brisbane example is you couldn't do this. It's just to say that there's in an ideal world everything could be perpendicular and you've got these perfect sight lines. But I will just go back actually. If we did have this perpendicular, there's also the connectivity issue in that a cyclist would then have to really slow down, and it's not as an attractive as facility if you're just managing that tight radius curve to cross perpendicular and then perpendicular again. That would really slow down your journey if you just want to get from A to B as fast as possible. So there's a whole realm of things to consider at these locations. But I'm glad that everyone seemed to pick up on those things. Now, where we do have the shared paths crossing roads, sorry, Ken, did you want to jump in there or keep going?
Oh, there's just a bit more continuing discussion about the signage arrangements at that site. Toby's had a look at the street view and lots of sign clutter. Let's keep moving on, Max. A bit more to cover.
Yeah, no dramas. So where we do have shared paths crossing road, very, very common to see these features, bollards. And there's a lot to talk about here, but with bollards, there's kind of two tiers that you want to consider when you're thinking about bollards. And the first one and the most imperative is this actually required? Because there are so many bollards on the bicycle network where it is feasible, it's just impossible for general traffic to be able to access these spaces. So perhaps they were put there once upon a time because they're worried about maintenance vehicles, accessing certain parts of the bicycle path or things like that. But I strongly suggest you're better off having a conversation with, maintenance crews and defining where the project is and not getting them to drive along the bike path than just installing these hazards, because that's what they are. They are hazards for cyclists at every single location. So that's my one little bugbear. If you do have to install them though, it's really, really, really important that they are as conspicuous as possible. So they're incredibly easy to see. This one here, the yellow, and they've got these kind of reflective tapes. That's a pretty good example, but this one in the middle is very, could be easily hidden if you were following another cyclist and they would obstruct the view of that middle bollard. They can see in front of you that there's a middle bollard and they can, adjust their path accordingly. But if you were right behind them, you may not be able to see that until right at the last minute, and that's definitely going to become an issue for you. The color of bollards as well. This is a stainless steel choice that's been applied within a bluestone background, so it blends perfectly in with that background, which is not a good example of installing these bollards. And these ones here in Brisbane, once again, Brisbane, I'm not trying to pick on Brisbane, but these ones are called banana bars, which is pretty funny, but they actually really squeeze this entrance or exit point for cyclists. So it can create this issue where you actually, if you had two opposing path users kind of getting squished together at that point. So they're not being installed anymore. They're actually being replaced with hold rails and other types of bollards, but you may see them around Brisbane. A few more bollards and these types of treatments as well. This kind of chicane treatment is not a bad way to slow down cyclists if that's perceived to be an incredibly important thing as they're approaching a road environment. That could be particularly relevant if they were approaching, a high-speed carriageway, or where they don't have priority going across there. So you want to say you need to slow down, you need to give way. The chicane treatments can work quite well. And this last one was just in Hobart as well, just using these U-rails or hold rails. Instead of being a hold feature though, it's being used as an actual obstruction in the path. I'll quickly chat about this bollard in particular, which as you can see has been struck many, many times. This is on a very, very popular commuter route within Melbourne, so a bike path within Melbourne. And this is what it looked like beforehand, and this is what it looked like afterwards. After this fellow here, he actually collided with the bollard and suffered wrist and facial injuries. And while waiting for the ambulance to arrive at this location, 2 other cyclists hit the same bollard within that half an hour period. So I'm not trying to be too dramatic when I say, but if you're installing bollards, particularly if they're in the middle of the path, they will get struck by cyclists. So being incredibly aware that they are a hazard. Yes, they can be used to deter vehicle movements, but at the same time, they are a risk for cyclists.
Does the height make them more visible?
Yes, but at the same time, if you raise them up too much, you've got the risk of handlebars snagging there as well. Or I've seen bollards as well, which also have little, almost like outreaches, little mast arm kind of things to make them more obvious. But what you're just doing is you're reducing the space then for an errant cyclist to safely get away from that hazard. So lots of things to consider there.
And path lighting a requirement then?
It's a good question. So I do have an example of that, which I will hop into in a second, but I just wanted to, instead of focusing on the negative, we'll have a look at, well, what could be done to, better apply a treatment within these locations. So really positive, beautiful one is to use vegetation to create this kind of splitter island, which is what you'd use within, like a minor road or a minor street on the road network. And the landscaping itself can be used as a deterrent, or if it's really considered necessary, you can put a bollard in the middle of that vegetation, because it's pretty evident to cyclists that, okay, I'm not going to ride into the vegetation that's there. So you can put a bollard smack in the middle of that. Really big fan of this type of terminal, as it's called, just like where the shared path ends at a carriageway. Not very common though, which is unfortunate. Here is an example of one, which I really, really like this design because it's very, very clear what's going on there. For cyclists, it's pretty unlikely that cyclists will ride into those bollards, and difficult to see, but those are actually little solar lights as well. So they are illuminated at night. So when it's low light conditions, you'll still be able to see them, which was raised earlier by the path lighting requirements and things like that. In terms of lighting, not just at these hazard locations, but throughout the path, you can have a flick through AS 1158 for the actual specifications, because there are requirements, but generally shared paths are quite poorly lit. Even very, very common, heavily used paths don't have great lightings. Maybe at intersections with, the general road network, but I can't say they're commonly lit all through the mid-block. There's an exception that I can think of actually on the upfield bike path that we were just talking about before, but they actually use little lights that are so it's adjacent a rail corridor, and they've used a fence to demarcate the edge of the shared path and where the rail corridor starts. And within that fence itself, within the top rail, they have little lights that hang on the underside that are completely hidden during the day. You'd have no idea that they're there. But during low light conditions, they light up and just cast light straight onto the shared path. So it's not like the typical street lighting columns and using, mast arms or outreach arms or anything like that. It's actually using an existing fencing system and installing these lights on the underside of that. But it's a whole different world getting into the lighting conversation. So I might just leave it for there at the moment, but happy to expand on that if you're interested. Also, just wanted to quickly touch on DDA requirements for shared path, where you've got the priority crossing. And this is provided, it's in the Australian standards as well as the Austroads guides, but we do need to remember that the tactile ground surface indicators, TGSIs, are still required where you're doing these raised crossings. So people with low visibility or vision impairments, they are aware that they're about to cross a carriageway. So just given in this little note here as part of the DDA. So we need to make sure all of that is crystal clear. Shared paths crossing shared paths. I've got a little photo game here to play, Ken, and I might have to just get stuck through these next slides, and I'm happy to take on any questions for the next module, if that's all right, Ken?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, no dramas. So this is a shared path crossing a shared path, and we can see here we have a very, very confused cyclist here. And I'd like to just ask the group, I'll get rid of the cyclist and move that away. I'd like to just ask the group, what do you think is wrong with this photo? So what's drawing your attention?
Okay, pop your comments in there. We've got a couple already. There's a couple of questions which, as Max mentioned, we'll get some answers ready for the start of next session. So don't worry if you feel you've been missed there. We've got a copy of the chat. Right, we go. No priority, no giveaway line, no wayfinding signs, no clear delineation or priority not there, no priority.
Fabulous. Well, that's excellent. Perhaps a prize out there to the first no priority.
Yeah, well, I'll give it to Rosie because Toby already got one for this session.
Okay.
And it was pretty much, maybe Toby's just got slightly better internet connection. That was the only difference.
Excellent. Good. So for those that are perhaps not, haven't heard that term before, but priority just means assigning one leg as the main thoroughfare, which in this example I'm just showing this is what I'm considering the main carriageway or the main route, and the other one is the minor leg. So assigning priority to that main leg and then putting either a stop sign or a give way for that leg there facing that direction, just so path users understand, well, you don't just get to this Y intersection and, hope for the best. There's an actual order of precedence, which path user gets right of way. Exactly how we would manage things on our road network. In saying that, I came across a Y intersection last week in Moreland City Council, Ken, just around the corner from the office. So they still exist. And there was no priority.
There you go.
Okay. Loved also the mention of the wayfinding signage. And in fact, it's such an important issue that Austroads have written an entire report that discusses bicycle wayfinding. In other words, where does this path go and am I on the right path? We across Australia have different ways of doing it. There's not one national guidance document that is applicable to all of our jurisdictions. So I'd recommend just making sure that you're referencing what's relevant to your particular jurisdiction prior to looking at any of this information. But long story short, generally what's provided is a little bicycle symbol, colors that are different to surrounding signs, just to indicate that it's for bikes, and things like distances or how long in minutes it will take to get there. What I really like in international jurisdictions is they commonly use route numbers. So you can see that one there is in Copenhagen, and this one over here is in the Netherlands. But you can see route number 2, route number 6, route number 5, route number 3, etc. So as a path user, if you were going to this area for the first time, you can have a quick look at the map and know, okay, route number 3 goes from the museum to the train station. I just stay on route number 3 and that's me sorted. And it's also color coordinated as well, which is very handy. So I tend to prefer that as a way to communicate that. But as I mentioned, we don't have national, consistency how to apply these things. So I'd really recommend, if you are within this space, making sure it's at least consistent within your route, because you don't want things changing from the start of an alignment to the end of the alignment. If you're looking at the entire corridor, just keep it consistent with how things have been signed throughout, particularly relevant to things like rail trails that go on for, tens of kilometers. But yes, last thing I wanted to mention is just where shared paths cross over with really, really dense pedestrian areas. A more minor type of treatment is by installing kind of pavement markings as a reminder that there's pedestrians in this area. This might have some effect on cyclists, but it's likely to be negligible. This example is actually in Western Australia. It's outside a train station in Perth, and they've installed what looks like, a typical road intersection. Basically, they've got splitter islands, they've got, all this coloured pavement, they've got curb and channel, they've got lots of things going on here to show that there's going to be pedestrians in this area. So cyclists, you need to slow down and give way. And because it is outside the train station, there's lots of pedestrians that cross over in this direction, and giving them priority. Another good treatment that could have been used in this site is providing a raised crossing point for pedestrians here. Similar to what we were doing with vehicles, forcing them to slow down. You can also do that for cyclists as well. So if you had raised that whole crossing up, said give way to pedestrians, just another way that that particular site could have been treated. That is the end of today's session. So we've had awesome discussion in the chat, which is great to see. Apologies I didn't get to your question, but we will tackle that in the next module on Thursday. But I might hand over to you, Ken. And I just mentioned this is actually a real site where the shared path just ends to nothing. And adjacent here is a multi-lane, high-speed environment. So it's not a great spot for cyclists just to be ending there, because likely they're going to want to continue their journey and get somewhere else. So that little bit of extra thought of how those end of treatments are managed. Over to you, Ken, though.
All right, Max, I'm going to steal the screen here, and I'm going to talk to the learning management system. You might want to have a read of the awesome chat going on there, Max, and try and catch up and take a note of the questions you might want to cover. I assume you can see the learning management system on my screen. Okay, so as we mentioned, you've got to get access to this learning management system if you have not already. You can't complete the course without it. And you'll find yourself in here, cycling infrastructure. This is the link that doesn't change to log into the webinars if you need to, but you've been emailed that out as well. Nice little spot here to add some introduction and say hello to other participants, see who's on the course and the like. We've got lots of reference documents and resources in here. You can see quite a number of documents in there. but we're loving the fact that we're getting lots of awesome documents put into the chat, reference material and the like. If you want to put any resources in, you can drop them into this as well for others to have a look at. I'm sure others are downloading them as they get put into the chat as well, and just some general course information. But this is module 1. We're into module one here. You can see the, you've got a few things here. You've got the quiz, which Max mentioned. To do the quiz, you're going to have to click on that, and you're going to have to attempt the quiz. You get 3 attempts at it. You need to get more than 80%. I think you'll do all right. It's nothing too hard. But if you do it the first time and really struggle, might be a good opportunity to get in contact with Max there. The other thing, these are the slides from today. So you've got a PDF copy of those. The other thing we're going to ask you to do is have a look at this 360-degree footage. So if you click on that, it comes up in YouTube. Little tip, down here in your settings, you go to quality and make sure it's at the top quality. Otherwise, it can be down a bit. But this is what you will use the 360-degree goggles you got. So you can use your phone, find this, hit play, put it on, and then you will be able to just turn your head and it'll be like you're there live. And then you can play the video. If you can only do it on your desktop, that's not a problem as well. And so this is, you'll see Max and I come up and have a bit of a chat to you, and then we'll do some riding through, and you get to see these like you're on the saddle, and get to check out the different features. So we want you to have a look at both scenarios and watch that video before next session, because Max will start with a little bit of discussion about some different crossing facilities. So hopefully that makes sense. Make sure you can get access to Learning Management System. For next session, we're going to have a little bit of trivia to kick it off. Max likes to ask a bit of random trivia, sometimes general knowledge or others, give out a few prizes, incentivize you to log in 3 minutes early or so and be ready to go as we hit the top of the hour. But that's pretty much where we're at. Max, anything you need to cover before we close off today?
No, that's wonderful. Thanks everyone that have also put in the introductions. I'm not sure if you mentioned that there, Ken, but for those that have said hello to the group, and it's always good to hear your background and your level of cycling experience. So anyone that hasn't done that so far, feel free to just jot down some notes. Other than that, thanks for your contributions today, and we look forward to chatting more cycling on Thursday.
Yeah, thank you all. Great input. We'll see you at the next session.
Bye for now. Thank you.